Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this seminar on regional development banks. My name is Mirena Pencheva. I work at the European Parliament, and I have the pleasure to chair tonight's event. This online event is one of several this term which focus on the European institutional architecture and is hosted by the European Political Economy Project at the European Studies Centre. Tonight's event is dedicated to the recently published book on regional development banks in the world economy. Regional development banks have become increasingly important in the world economy, but have also been relatively under-researched, and this is what this book addresses. It provides an analytical framework that includes a revised categorization of regional development banks by geographic operation and function. Part 1 offers detailed analysis of the origins, evolution, and contemporary role of the major regional development banks. Part 2 offers comparative analysis of key topics in regional development banks, examining their initial design and their changing business models. The volume ends with a critical reflection on the role played by regional development banks to date and the strong defense of the need for these banks in an increasingly complex world economy. We are very excited to welcome 5 speakers to present and discuss the book. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and the rest of the time will be dedicated to the Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A box and not the chat box. The chat box will be reserved for the bios of the speakers. When you post your questions in the Q&A box, please indicate if you would prefer that I ask on your behalf. If not, and provided that we have enough time, I will call on Julie Adams, who is the power behind the scenes, to unmute you so you can ask your question live. Be aware that the presentations are being recorded, but we will switch off the recording when we reach the Q&A part of the seminar. Now, let me briefly present our speakers before I give them the floor. I will present all of them so that I don't break up the presentations too much. Our first speaker will be Daniel Diaz Fuentes, who is full professor of applied economics in the Department of Economics at the University of Cantabria. He is vice president of the World Economy Society and co-director of the Inter-University Master in Economics and the Inter-University PhD in Economics between the Universities of Cantabria, Oviedo, and the Basque Country. Our second speaker is Judith Clifton. She is full professor of applied economics in the Department of Economics at the University of Cantabria. She is founding director of the Jean Monnet Chair of EU Economic Policy for Business and Civil Society at the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences, University of Cantabria, and principal investigator on one of the largest projects to date on disruptive technologies in the public sector, Token. Judith and Daniel will give us a general overview of the main issues covered in the book and of the role of regional development banks in the world economy. After all the presentations, Daniel will also say a few words about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Our third speaker is Erika Kraemer-Mbula, who is professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg and DST NRF Newton Fund Trilateral Chair in Transformative Innovation, the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Sustainable Development, based at the College of Business and Economics of the University of Johannesburg. Her work focuses on alternative development paths for African economies, and she will tell us about the African Development Bank. After that, we will hear from Carlos Andrés Brando, who is former Dean of Economics at Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano, and is currently adjunct lecturer in economic history at Colegio de Estudios Superiores de Administración in Bogota. His presentation will focus on the Latin America's Development Bank. And last but not least, we have David Howarth, who is full professor of European Political Economy in the Institute of Political Science at the University of Luxembourg. He is a founding member of the University of Luxembourg's Robert Schuman Initiative, since 2016, a leading interdisciplinary center for study of European Union affairs and recognized and funded twice by the European Commission as a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. His presentation will focus on the European Investment Bank. And so, without further ado, let me give the floor to our first speaker, Daniel. Daniel, go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mirena. Thank you all of you for being here. It would be like to thank to the European Studies Center of Santander's Colegio, in particular to European Political Economy Project and Charles N. Of course, thank to Mirena as a chair and all the speakers. well, the topic is general. Regional development banks have increased their importance as regards both the quantity and the quality of their finance activities as intermediaries and investors, in most cases taking over in absolute and relative terms to the traditional global multilateral bank, like the World Bank. In the regions and for particular members, they are much more important than these global institutions. And what is amazing is despite the massive number of publications and research projects on global financial institutions, such as the World Bank or the IMF, there are few contributions on the role of these regional development banks. This seminar is motivated by our recent published book in Oxford University Press. We selected key experts to work on 8 larger regional development banks and as well comparative studies. We established common question hypotheses about the origins, transformation, governance, and current challenges of these banks. Most of these banks, regional development banks, are not new. They emerged in the 2 decades after the Second World War, emulating the World Bank or International Bank of Reconstruction and Development in their statutory objectives or mandates that were mainly development and investment, and to complement this global institution more efficiently and efficiently at regional or sub-regional level. Certain regional development banks are still emerging, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and many other cases like that. But this is more important. But it's more important to analyze the transformations of the traditional regional development banks that are innovating in terms of their functions, facilities, as lenders, as investors, to respond to new financial, technological, environmental, or the pandemic challenges. Most of these regional or sub-regional have been for long term more important than the global in relative terms, but no so far away, the most important multilateral development bank or regional development bank and multilateral development bank has been the European Investment Bank that overtake the World Bank in 1991, just the same year that was created the EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, that was created in particular with the IEB as a main shareholder and European member states, European Union member states as a shareholder, just with a particular objective: the transformation, the systemic transformation of Eastern Europe and the area. But we go to the other extreme and we take a tiny, small, sub-regional development bank, regional development bank. We can see that for most of the 6 member states, Costa Rica, Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, the Central American Bank of Economic Integration is much more important than the large Inter-American Development Bank. This bank was created more or less at the same time the European Investment Bank and has been supporting the development of these areas and is much more important than the World Bank in certain countries, well, rich and poor, than the World Bank and the IBRD together. This is a good example. We have much more examples. I think that is a central. But regional development banks have undergone a recent renaissance, in particular in the context of the shifting wealth, the increasing importance of the emerging economies. For example, the CAF, the Andean Corporation for Development of the Andean countries, is called today the Development Bank of Latin America, with a similar number than the Inter-American Development Bank, that is dominated by donor country, the United States. And it's first in this year as a new Secretary of General Secretary President from the United States. had created a large controversy. And probably the most prominent case of this shifting well is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which contribution as well is in this book and in a conclusion today. A central question of this change is to what extent will this regional development bank governance and shareholder arrangement be changed to reflect this change in the world economy? Another point is that regional development banks have advantages associated with a greater geographical, economic, and cultural proximity with regards to their shareholders and the countries to which they provide loans. There is no or less conditionality than in the traditional credits. Arrangements through negotiations are easier than in the global multilateral banks or the larger regional development banks, on the assumption that the members are both lenders and borrowers. Judith will extend on this topic. But like in the 70s and 80s with the debt crisis, from the global financial crisis in Europe in particular, the criticism of the role of the global, and in particular the regional development banks and the European Investment Bank, has intensified. We have analyzed that, and you see how it was constructed, the Troika with the IMF and other financial institutions. But as well, the positive part is that new policies in Europe emerged with the European Fund for Strategic Investment that increased its impact, and as well is called to be transformed in the Green Bank, the Global Green Bank, and a new European architecture for the rest of the world. In fact, these changes in the European case have gone beyond the crisis, and some colleagues that we have been working in other recent publications, Mertens and Timman, state that there is a reinvention of development banking in the European Union. This reinvention allowed for industrial policies in the single market and the emergence of the new field of industrial policy. In this case, the European Investment Bank is part of a network with a national development bank like the KfW, the CDP, the BGK, or the ICO in Spain, and a network. And as well, new development banks have been created with this aim. This corresponds as well with the vision that Ocampo and Clifton has of the development bank and regional development banks in other areas. Last but not least, it's important to see that the COVID has dealt a devastating economic blow around the world. Regional development banks, like we analyzed, and national development banks have provided supportive credit, fiscal assistance, expert advice, and macroeconomic stability in ways that private financial institutions are often unable or unwilling to do. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, I will now give the floor straight away to our second speaker, Judith. Judith, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mirena. Thank you very much for inviting us to talk about our book. I will talk briefly about the framework of the book, and I will use it to answer the question, why do we still need regional development banks, which is the question I've been asked to answer. So to do that, I'll break the question down into two sub-questions. I'd like to think about what the original justifications for regional development banks were when the banks were first created in the 50s, 60s, 70s, what was the literature saying, and ask whether those original justifications in the literature are still valid. And then I'd like to think whether there's some new justifications which are making the role of regional development banks also pronounced and relevant. So to go to the first part of the question, sub-question, what were the original justifications for regional development banks? Well, the classical literature, of which there is some, but not as much as there is on the multilateral peers of the regional development banks. For example, one of the most cited authors is Stephanie Griffith-Jones. And her work really features what the pros and cons of regional development banks are versus multilateral development banks. And so she'll talk about the geographical nature of the bank, that it's in the place, it's in the place where the money is lent and used, implemented. So geographically, the bank is closer to where the people are literally. Culturally and linguistically, the bank will understand the region better, they speak the same language. Economically, the economic system is well known to the people who work in the bank because they are from that region, and also politically. So proximity to the region would be one advantage in all these different facets of regional development banks over the multilateral. At the same time, the Regional Development Bank is thought to be better positioned to give voice to all of its members, but particularly the smaller and medium-sized member countries that might find it difficult to exercise a voice in the multilateral lending institutions. And at the same time, the regional development banks are supposed to be more flexible, working and leaning on more peer pressure than the hard conditionality, which is usually associated with the multilateral development bank. So basically, these classical reasons that are given to justify the existence of regional development banks seem very much to be valid today. But beyond these kind of classic reasons, when we worked together, David Howarth, Daniel Diaz Fuentes and I, on our introduction to the book, we decided to try and categorize the regional development banks. And we categorized them by geographical category, where they are, what their region, how they relate to the region, and what their function. So as regards to the AIDB, we have the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank. These are continental regional development banks. And then we have the sub-regional, which will be CABI, CAF, and the major functions. And we came up with 5 major functions: development, regional integration, market promotion, multipolarity reinforcement, and interventionist market shaping policy. And what we found is that the work of the regional development banks over time shifted. In the first wave of creation of regional development banks in the 50s and 60s, the continental regional development banks focused very much on development, and the sub-regional regional development banks focused much more on development and integration. When we come to the second wave of regional development banks in the 1990s, the new regional development banks are functioning much more on the market development. And the pre-existing regional development banks also take a turn towards the market. And in the third wave, in the beginning of the 21st century, we start to see logic. There's a rethinking of promoting the market. There's definitely a rediscovery of more interventionist investment policy, more industrial policy, and more attention to have strategic policy towards international public goods and bads, for example, the environment. So basically, what we've found when we look at all these different regional development banks over time is they've tended to shift where they concentrate their energy, and to, in general way, they have responded well to the region. So they've gone through these different shifts and delivered to the regions, all in slightly different balances, which is another thing that we cover in the individual chapters in the book on the different regional development banks. And then finally, are there new justifications for the regional development banks? Well, we can take the original classic arguments of Griffiths-Jones and apply them to the new reality, as Daniel Diaz Fuentes said about shifting wealth. If we have a shift of wealth from the south to the east, some of these regions don't have regional development banks and want to establish them. Some of them have them, but they're not necessarily sufficient. So they will establish more. Now, if multilateral development banks are slow to change their power structure, as Robert Wade has suggested, regional development banks are proving a nice solution for these re-emerging or emerging regions. And the case of China, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the chapter we have talks about the two-legged strategy of the Chinese government. On the one hand, they decide to stay inside the traditional multilateral development banks, even though they're not satisfied with the lack of, let's say, adjustment to a new economic reality. And at the same time, they start to set up new and more regional development banks. And we can look at, for example, compare the role of China in the AIIB to the role in its more traditional role assigned by the multilateral development banks, and we see it's quite different. And then finally, the last piece of evidence really I have is if we talk about our framework, we look at geography and function, we can see clearly that there's a rise in the need to address public goods and public bads, the climate for one thing and innovation on the other. And so we're seeing that regional development are stepping up to interpret those new international public goods and bads for the region. For example, in the European Commission, we have the Investment Plan for Europe and requirements that the European Investment Bank is doing much more on climate change. And so we do think that this way that the bank has been adaptable to different factors and activities it can do, and it's definitely in the recent period, moving towards the regional interpretation of the public goods and bads. So my conclusion is that, regional development banks are still important. We need to pay attention to them as actors and judge them on how well they adapt their geographical reach and their functions to deal with key issues facing the planet, climate change, and the welfare of its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. That was very, very interesting. And I would now like to give the floor to our next speaker, Erika, who will tell us about the African Development Bank. Erika, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much for giving me the floor and for the introduction. I hope you can see my slides well.
Yes.
It is a pleasure to be here, and I would like to start by really thanking the book editors for the academic leadership and for inviting me to contribute with the book with a chapter to this book. It's really an honor to be part of this project. My chapter was focused on the African Development Bank Group, which is one of the largest development institutions in the continent. It currently has 81 members, 54 regional and 27 non-regional members. It has a very strong local presence, and in the slide you can see that it has about 35 country offices across the continent, dealing with various topics such as health, education, infrastructure, and others. Its offering to its members goes well beyond providing financial support and includes generating data and knowledge, products, providing technical advice, and also, very importantly, its convening power. It also has received less attention in the literature when we compare it to other regional development banks and international financial institutions more generally. So this chapter tried to address this gap in the literature and highlights very much the particular history and the evolution of the African Development Bank, which has led it to acquire quite a unique role in the continent, which somehow is different to what other bilateral and multilateral development partners do offer. The chapter does describe the governance structure of the bank, operating through 3 independent but connected entities, which is the African Development Bank and 2 funds, the African Development Fund and the Nigerian Trust Fund. It also describes in some of its sections the voting system and how it's been such a contentious matter throughout the history of the bank. I will not go into the details here, but some of these issues do relate to giving a voice to smaller members, which is something that Judith just mentioned in her presentation. I will focus in my presentation on how the bank, one of the bank's main strengths is the perception by its member of being a trusted partner. The members do see the bank as understanding and engaging in the African way with African solutions. It aligns with the priorities of regional partners and is an advocate of the continent in global fora, projecting this African voice. So this sense of ownership and trust among the borrowers puts the bank in a very strong leadership position in the region. The chapter argues that it is through this unique role that the bank is so well placed to fulfilling its objective of providing African solutions to African problems, which include some of the challenges that the continent is facing going forward. And I will get back to that at the end of my presentation. The bank was established in 1964 in the midst of Africa's independence and driven by a very strong sentiment of Pan-Africanism. So in this context, the bank really established itself or identified its primary objectives as the preservation of Africa's autonomy and interest and and seeing itself as a tool for African integration. So these objectives are still prevalent today, and you can see them reflected in several strategic documents, such as the African Development Bank strategy for 2013-2022, which was initially committed to improving the quality of Africa's growth, to make it greener and more inclusive. Also resonating with the comments that Judith just made about that shift in the focus and prioritization. With the SDGs coming up in 2015 and Agenda 2063, the bank revisited its strategy and its operational objectives to include what is called the High Five goals. And these are 5 priority areas that are intended to align precisely with the Sustainable Development Goals. They are Light Up Africa, Empower Africa, Feed Africa, Industrialize, Integrate, and Improve the quality of life for the people of Africa. You can see in the slide how they are prioritized in terms of funding. There was a deliberate attempt to align these High Five goals with the newly released the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2016 back in 2063 back in 2016. In a way, despite such an African focus and such a interest in supporting African priorities, there was an understanding that the future of Africa transcends the continent itself, and that many of the challenges experienced in Africa are those of humanity. The High Five goals were followed by substantial disbursements, $6.6 billion in 2018, which was quite close to the World Bank's disbursements in the same year, up to nearly 8.9 billion. And these investments led to substantial improvements through various projects that I will not describe in this presentation. So I just want to, with the last couple of minutes, highlight why an institution such as the African Development Bank is essential as we move forward, particularly in the context of Africa. There are many trends and developments that raise new challenges and new opportunities, such as demographic trends and technology developments, institutional developments such as the African Continental Free Trade Area that came into force last year and brings a whole new set of opportunities to the economic development of the continent. But I will focus my reflection on the current pandemic and the prospects of meeting the SDGs, which have become compromised. The consequences of this crisis have become even worse in weaker economies, least developed countries that are mostly found in Africa, and at the same time, even though there are clear challenges in accomplishing the Sustainable Development Goals, the pandemic has made very evident that meeting the SDGs is a matter of urgency and is an essential objective for Africa and for humanity. They need to cover basic needs related to health and food. They need to have strong regional markets and supporting infrastructure. The digital divide, which has resulted in unequal access to online education during lockdown. The quality of employment and entrepreneurship and the danger of precarious informal employment, vulnerable to exploitation, poverty, and hunger. So these were issues that were pressing issues in Africa before COVID, but they have been exacerbated and made more visible through the crisis. So recovering from this crisis and moving towards a more inclusive and green transition are not separate challenges. So there's no, in a way, there's no contradiction between recovering from the current crisis and looking through these longer term objectives. They are closely interlinked. And we have seen countries setting up relief measures, intervening to stimulate the economy, and doing all sorts of interventions, financial interventions in quite unprecedented ways. But finding long-term solutions requires more than money. It requires convening power. It requires coordination and alignment, collaboration, and market shaping, as this book argues. The COVID crisis is in a way an opportunity to reevaluate the role of the African Development Bank in supporting these large collaborative solutions. And in this case, the chapter, as it describes, is exceptionally well positioned to not only direct funding to the most pressing issues, such as health, employment creation, digitization, but also directing funding to those most needing countries, and leverage public resources to help minimize the economic decline and support the recovery. And as well as looking at this longer term structural transformation. So to fulfill that role, the bank may need to look at two things. One, leverage its reputation as a trusted partner, using its local presence and its ability to convene and expertise to influence national policy and governance. And secondly, reinforce its role as a catalyst to more effectively partner and complement the efforts from all the other development funders, which may mean revisiting some of the bank's governance structures, including those related to voting rules. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erika, for this very, very comprehensive and interesting presentation. I will now turn to Carlos to tell us about the Latin American Development Bank. Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mirena. Good afternoon to you, to everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I will start my presentation quoting a figure. Last year, the Andean Development Corporation, or CAF, as is locally known here in Latin America, reached $14.2 billion in loan approvals. And this is an amount that is just about the same of that lent by its main competitor in the region, the Inter-American Bank. In fact, in recent years, CAF has outperformed the IADB when it comes to lending commitments. And I think that this is quite an achievement, and I will argue it is the result of a major transformation experienced by the bank in the last 25 years. CAF went from being a relatively modest sub-regional development bank, financing sluggish industrial integration and trade amongst the Andean group, to become Latin America's main development bank, the Andean group being comprised by Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. So what I will do is that I will emphasize the three key elements of this transformation. First, CAF went continental or global, expanding its membership from the founding nations plus Mexico, which had joined in 1990, to 17 members nowadays, including Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, as well as other Central American and Caribbean countries. And it also went beyond that, beyond the continent, to integrate Spain and Portugal. As one inevitable outcome of this enlargement process, founding members, in particular Bolivia and Ecuador, which since the very beginnings of CAF had received preferential treatment for being the least developed within the group, they have seen their relative shares of credit allocations decline. However, by as late as 2016, both these countries continue to figure as net recipients of CAF's financing deals. That is to say that they take out more than they put in. No doubt, small nations like these have managed to get their voices heard in a regional development bank such as this, thanks to the practice and the maintenance of equal voting representation regardless of shareholding participation. In other words, one director, one vote. Secondly, regarding CAF's portfolio, the changes have also been quite profound. The long-term distribution of loans by sector shifted from over 60% heading towards the execution of industrial manufacturing ventures in the 1970s and the 1980s on average, to less than 10% since the 2000s. Meanwhile, investments in infrastructure projects, mainly transport, electricity, communications, and natural gas, have received around 50% of those loans. Other sectors have also gone up, such as public administration reform, health, tourism, and capital market development. I think it's important to make clear at this point that unlike the Inter-American Development Bank, CAF has continued lending without policy-based conditionalities, conditionalities that we know have been aimed at advancing the sort of market-oriented reforms that Washington has privileged as solutions for the region. It is also important to say that CAF has accommodated its businesses in hardship. It has played identifiable counter-cyclical roles in times of economic slowdown, such as in the debt crisis, or more recently in the Great Recession. And it has done so, shifting away its investment portfolio from long-term loans to short-term lending. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the last few decades, CAF managed to position itself successfully in international capital markets. Investment grade rating was obtained in 1993 by the most important credit rating agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. And since then, the corporation ratings have only improved. I think that this particularly has been paramount. CAF began issuing medium and long-term bonds in Asia, Europe, and in the US capital markets. And whereas in the 1980s, for instance, paid-in capital accounted for 40% of all funding sources, in the early 2010s, bonds accounted for nearly half of all funding. It has been the ability to tap international capital markets what has allowed CAF to increase its leverage and expand its operations in the way that it has done. I'll finish off by saying that this is a regional development bank as like no other that has been able to compete on a global scale, that is owned and managed by relatively poor countries lending to those very same poor countries, and that it has allowed a lot of voice to smaller nations in a way in which perhaps no other regional development bank has. Thank you very much, Mirena. I think that my time is up.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That was very, very interesting. And our last speaker tonight will be David, who will tell us about the European Investment Bank. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a first point to note is that the European Investment Bank refuses the development bank and regional development bank labels and presents itself as an MFI, a multilateral financial institution. Nonetheless, we included in our book for reasons which should become evident as I make my presentation. Also, we would argue that the EIB actually demonstrates, and its development over the years, and the development specifically of its lending, has demonstrated the features of many or most regional development banks and how they've transformed themselves over the past 50 or 60 years. Now, the European Investment Bank's 1958 mandate prioritized regional integration, and indeed regional integration has always been present, thus the funding of the transport infrastructural projects, the TENs of the 1990s, but we would argue that it declined in relative importance. And the EIB over time has also developed a de facto development agenda, starting in the 1960s with initially more funds going to poor European regions, and notably the Mezzogiorno, often justified in terms of better integrating these areas, regions into the European internal market. The European Investment Bank also developed a development agenda beyond the European communities shortly after its creation from 1963, and such lending was allowed on the grounds that it was to benefit the community. So in other words, the European Investment Bank did look beyond the region. What we see over time is a shift in European Investment Bank priorities. In their excellent chapter for our edited volume, Judith, Clifton, Daniel Fuentes, and Ana Lara Gomez show a shift away from the EIB's regional integration mandate from the 1980s onwards. And with, in fact, member states increasingly getting out from the EIB, getting funding from the EIB in terms of, in proportion to what they're putting in and their capital contribution to the European Investment Bank. So therefore, effectively a downgrading of the regional integration and arguably development and elements of the bank's priorities. And we also argue that that there is clear evidence of the European Investment Bank operating as an agency, and we see elements of this agency in most of our other regional development banks. That is, the European Investment Bank operating as an autonomous actor in relation to its member state principles. And notably, the European Investment Bank has promoted market making, and it started very much in the 1980s. The market making goals became more important for almost all our regional development banks. And in the chapter in our volume by myself and Moritz Liebe, we look at the European Investment Bank's important role in promoting public-private partnerships, PFI, which was very much a precursor to the pre-PPP public-private partnership efforts of all other, the MFIs and other regional development banks and most EU member states for the 2000s. Now, there were several features of this promotion. There were within the European Investment Bank, mostly British policy entrepreneurs who had experience either in the British UK Treasury or in the British private sector. There was the establishment of expertise in the EIB, notably through EPIC. There was the EIB's obligation for member states that wish to continue receiving EIB funding loans to create PPP units. So there's no obligation to use those units or make use of PPP. But there's an obligation to create the units. So therefore, to explore the use of expanded use of PPPs in all the member states that receive EIB funding. There was also EIB networking and also co-financing of PPPs with other regional development banks around the world. Now, few EU member states promoted PPPs prior to the 2000s, and several member states were opposed. In some countries like France and Germany, PPPs are not part of the public financing tradition. And then, in terms of the final stage that we've detected with regard to the development of regional development bank lending and activities over the past 50 to 60 years, is the promotion of a more interventionist industrial policy, market shaping policy. And in the context with regard to the European Investment Bank, this took off very much in the 2010s. Werner Hoyer, the president of the European Investment Bank, claimed responsibility for the Juncker plan, which is a plan for providing long-term investment funds for European development. And also, more recently, the European Investment Bank has metamorphosized itself into a self-anointed climate bank, the world's first international climate bank, from 2019, which officially is about supporting the European Union's Green Deal, and it's about the promotion of green industrial development and an end of fossil fuel financing after 2021. And Helen Cavadia, who's contributed a great chapter in our edited volume on comparing the business plans of the European Investment Bank and the AIIB. Helen has recently published an article in the journal Politics and Governance on the transformation of the EIB into this climate bank and its important role as an agent, autonomous agent in relation to other EU institutions and member states in doing so. And most recently, the EIB was rather autonomous in the design of the European Guarantee Fund. This is a fund created in 2020 of 25 billion euros to leverage up to 200 billion euros to increase funding specifically to small and medium-sized enterprises, which were badly affected because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So why should you be interested in the EIB and its development? Well, the EIB is not only the world's biggest public lender, it is also the world's biggest lender. The EIB is notoriously non-transparent, as confirmed by Transparency International. It's one of the least transparent international financial institutions. And the European Investment Bank is not supposed to be a proactive policymaking body. It's a policy taker. It's not a policymaker. It's there to serve the European Union policies that are set by the Council and Commission. But nonetheless, we argue in our chapter, my chapter with Moritz Lieber, that in fact the EIB has gone well beyond acting policy-taking role. And also a number of EIB policies, notably PPP promotion, are very controversial. And indeed, a number of EIB lending more generally has been considered very controversial. And the subtitle of the European Court of Auditors 2018 report on PPPs in the EU was widespread shortcomings and limited benefits. And the European Court of Auditors was very critical of the EIB's active promotion. So to conclude, regional development bank development patterns that we've seen over the past 50, 60 years have shown up as well in the development of the European Investment Bank. Initially, the importance of regional integration that's established in the mandate of the EIB to support European integration has declined in relative importance over the past 40 years. And there was increased a development agenda from the 1960s as well. We have increased focus on market making activities, market promotion activities from the 1980s. And most recently, we see an increasingly interventionist European Investment Bank, as we've seen elsewhere around the world, with the Juncker Plan, the European Long-Term Investment Funds, the green industry promotion with the EIB as a climate bank, and the design of the European Guarantee Fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you once again to all the speakers for your excellent presentations. So before we go to the Q&A session, I will first give the floor once again to Daniel to tell us a few words about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So Daniel, you have the floor. You're muted.
Is the slide ready now? Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I am doing this presentation given that the Professor Xiang Shu from the Peking University had health problems and didn't contribute. But she sent an extended presentation that is available for all the people. This presentation definitely is part of the different perspectives that we adopt in the book, and it shows the emerging of new institutions, new regional development banks, a result of the rise of the emerging economies, in particular of China. And so Xinhuan arrived to the following conclusions. First, China undertook the leadership to establish the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, not only because the existing US-led multilateral development bank and regional development bank like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank failed to provide sufficient infrastructure finance, but also more importantly, because China was impatient with the slow progress in the governance reform of the existing multilateral development banks and regional development banks. Second, in comparison with the mandates of the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has much clearer sectoral and regional focus. While the Asian Infrastructure Bank's mandate may evolve over the time, there is good reason to believe that the Asian Infrastructure Bank will continue to focus on infrastructure financing it in the future. And last but not least, with a much clearer focus on infrastructure financing and rapidly growing membership, the Asian Infrastructure Bank has a much greater potential for enlarging its operation among diverse group of clients than the traditional Asian Development Bank. The AIBB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, environmental and social safeguard policy are as rigorous as the Asian Development Bank, but they have more tolerance for environmentally social risky projects that have greater development impact. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, we are now ready to move to the Q&A session, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is not going to be recorded, so we will stop the recording now.